also very much the organisers. It's great to have an opportunity to give a paper here, and I'm particularly loving the rock star treatment with the microphone and video cameras. It's very, very good for my ego. So this paper's kind of interesting because it ties together a lot of the things that we've seen, and also I think I can segue the philosophy of set theory into the main themes of the conference, so these issues to do with objectivity, cognition, and proof. So here's how I'm going to do this. What I'm going to do is I'm first just going to make some introductory remarks that many people will be aware of, but it's useful to situate the debate. And then I'm going to give a characterization of the relevant views I'm considering, namely absolutism, a very strong form of multiversism that's recently been proposed by Hamptons. And I'm then going to present the problem for the absolutist and exactly why the multiversist takes that position. I'm going to hit you with 3 objections to the multiversist in quick succession. And then 2 of them are to do with reference, and the 3rd one is more to do with some issues close to formalization, but also the philosophy of language. And then finally, I'm going to pick up the pieces in section 4, and I'm going to suggest some refinements of the multiverse view, or what we can learn from the philosophy of mathematics from this debate. So here's my aims. So I really want to push this radical multiverse view of Hamptons. I mean, it's very elegant, but it's deeply problematic in certain other senses. And I'm going to say that, look, this identifies a particular kind of reference or account of reference the multiversist can't use. And in particular, one that's got a history in sort of in a Seraphian tradition to do with the causal theory of knowledge and how we know mathematical objects. And I'm then really going to emphasize as well, look, if you want to be a Hamptonsian multiversist, you have to accept some very extreme consequences, even more extreme than you may already be aware of. Okay, so I get 2 of the themes of the conference out of the way here. So we have independence, so I think that deals with proof. Oh dear.
Just forget it.
I don't understand what that means. It looks bad though.
No, it doesn't.
So okay, we've got proof out of the way, but also there's been 2 reactions to this phenomenon of independence, namely bivalence versus non-bivalence. So I've got objectivity out of the way there as well. And I'm really concerned here with the dialectic between a view that standardly, though not totally obviously, thinks that independent statements like CH are true, namely absolutism, and one that thinks that you can have non-bivalent statements of set theory, and that's going to be the Hamptonsian multiversism. Okay, so I mean, let's start with absolutism. I'm sure we're all pretty familiar with this, but as we know, sets are formed or commonly thought to be formed in stages. And so this is the very simple view that we just have one universe of sets, which we denote V. And this is pretty pre-theoretically intuitive. It's kind of aesthetically pleasing. We get to solve all our mathematical questions. And of course, you're in good company like Gödel, Cantor, and more recently, Hugh Woodin. Now, just 2 assumptions that are going to generate the problem for the absolutist. So I'm going to assume Platonism of a quite strong kind. So the statements we make are true in virtue of some mind-independent reality. I'm not entirely sure that's essential to this debate, but it simplifies it. So I'm just gonna make it. This is an interesting separate paper to ask how much of this debate can we reformulate without that assumption. But this naturalist assumption here is going to be the really key one for understanding why the absolutists seem to have a problem, which is, look, if we have 2 views of ontology, and on this one I can interpret a piece of set theoretic discourse where this one can't, then in that respect, all other things being equal, this one's a better view of ontology. So we're trying to provide an interpretation of set theorists. So we can pretty quickly generate a problem for the absolutist when we look at standard set theoretic practice, and that is, well, fact one, we know that set theorists perform these model theoretic constructions that necessitate the addition of sets to the model. So the most obvious one of this is forcing, where you start with some ground model M, and it's probably a bit small. So we've got a ground model M, and we take some generic filter on a partial order G, stick it in there, close under the operations definable in M, and come to a new model of set theory, which we denote by MG. But the second fact that we've got to be aware of here is that, look, set theorists often use the symbol V while doing this practice. So, I mean, I'm going to take it as a controversial assumption that set theorists do force over V proper. I mean, it's a very subtle technical question with philosophical import. Exactly how the absolutists interpret forcing extensions of V. I'm not going to address it here, but let's just take it for the moment they do. Well, what does the absolutist say about these forcing extensions of V? So, for example, V has a forcing extension when CH is false. Well, by naturalism, they should try and take this at face value. So they should say, oh yeah, there is some V generic G up here, but hang on a minute, V is supposed to be all the sets there are, G looks pretty like a set, so something's gone wrong here. So this is Hamptons' solution, so just do away with absolutism. So he says there are many universes of set theory. Any first order model of set theory constitutes a universe, and no one universe is especially privileged. Now, I think to be clear here, there's a whole bunch of views in between absolutism and this Hamptonsian multiversism. And this is going to recur later in the talk. We're going to see one way out for Hamptons might be to accept slightly more absolutism. But this fairly simply seems to deal with this issue. So we say, oh look, when you thought you were in V, you weren't actually in some absolute universe. Rather, this is just one of many universes, and I can force here, I can force here, maybe I can do an ultra power or something, and we end up with this view where rather than having a universe, we've got a big multiverse, and it's kind of got this category theoretic nature. So it's a load of universes connected with arrows by the model theoretic constructions. And then, very simple to interpret claims about forcing extensions. You just say, well, yeah, you literally do move to a different model. There's no absolute universal sets. Okay, so just pause for reflection. We've got two views of ontology here. And they're both kind of pre-theoretically, well, I suppose the multiversist is sub-theoretically, post-theoretically. But we have these two views of ontology which are both quite appealing. You know, the absolute aesthetically and the multiversist can deal with this problem in model theory. But I'm going to press some worries against Hamptons that centre on accounts of reference. And I'm going to argue this either highlights a kind of minimal absolutist core that you need in any philosophy of mathematics whatsoever, or alternatively, it helps clarify and situate Hamptons' view within these modern sort of Beneserafian traditions. Okay, so let's look at exactly how Hamptons expresses this movement between models. So he uses the following sort of colourful language. So as a result, the fundamental objects of set theory have become models of set theory, and set theorists move with agility from one model to another. Now, I'm sure set theorists are very agile, and they do a lot of calisthenics and things, but they can't climb to Platonic heaven. Okay, that's just not possible. So I want an account of what's going on when we do this. We do this moving, and a natural way to understand the above is through reference. So you started by referring to this object, and then you did some model theoretic constructions, and then you moved your reference to this object in the multiverse. But we're saying we want to give an account of reference, But we've got to ask, well, how does this reference occur? It's a natural philosophical question to ask. We know that we want to do it through reference. What's the account? So Hampkins says things like this. So often the clearest way to refer to a set concept is to describe the universe in which it is instantiated. And in this article, I shall simply identify a set concept with the model of set theory to which it gives rise. Okay? So we've got giving descriptions of universes to pin down reference. So I describe V, and then the forcing construction is a way of describing VG from V. But of course, if we're doing descriptions, you have to ask, what are the resources here? So normally, when we're giving characterization of structure, we do so through the use of second-order resources. But Hampkins is very clear that anything stronger than first-order resources requires some mathematical understanding. This in turn is backed up by set theory. And so the notion, any of these notions are dependent on the notion of set, which is inherently indeterminate. So, it depends on which background you're working in, how we interpret these additional resources. So we're only working with first-order resources, and as we've heard throughout this conference, first-order resources are just woefully inadequate for characterizing structures up to isomorphism in this way. So Hampkins has a response to this, which is that we don't really pick out a universe determinately. So it's better to understand these descriptions as relative construction methods. So this picture I originally drew of the multiverse turned out it was a little bit misleading. Really, what we have is some form of multiverse, like so. And then I utter some set theoretic statement, say phi, ZFC plus phi. And this picks out a cloud of universes that satisfy this statement. Let's let it be CH. So ZFC plus CH holds here. Then I perform my model theoretic constructions. This occurs relative to each universe in that cloud. And I move to a different cloud. So let's say I stick in a Cohen reel. It will vary according to each universe. And I move to the ZFC plus not CH cloud. Okay, so he has this picture of reference, and things are very much more schematic that apply to lots of things at once. Okay, so we can now start to generate the first of the three problems against Hampkins. So there's going to be a regress involved in exactly what's going on with this picture. So it turns out that the model theoretic constructions possible are relative to the initial starting universe. So this is going to mean that the extent of the multiverse in itself is a relative notion. So that might have been my starting multiverse, but equally, I might have had a sort of strange shaped one like that included some different universes, didn't include some of the ones that we had originally. And then this is going to quickly give us a regress. So this is one of those situations where kind of explanation by picture is a lot clearer than describing it in words. So I state, let's let it be phi. And phi picks out, apparently, some cloud of universes within the multiverse. But hang on, if I'd said phi and my multiverse had been this one, I might have picked out a different cloud of universes. I mean, this has some universes that this one doesn't have, and possibly vice versa. So it turns out that our selection of the phi cloud was actually dependent upon selection of some universe V1 to delimit the extent of the multiverse to begin with. Okay. But wait a minute, so I'm picking out a universe V1. What resources am I using to do that? How am I picking out that universe? Well, it has to be first order. Can't pick it out definitely, so it turns out that picking out V1 should actually be construed as some reference to a different cloud. Let's call it C2. But wait, if the multiverse had been different, we'd have actually picked out some other cloud, C2. So it turns out that reference to this cloud C2 was dependent upon reference to some universe B2. Sorry, yes, B2. Okay. It's now clear we're going to get a reference. We just run it again and again and again, and we get a regress. Okay, so natural response when you're dealing with multiversism and things that are non-well founded is it vicious? Because they'll accept a lot more than you think. So here's a possible line of resistance that might push that it's not vicious, and this is actually going to highlight exactly what's going on and where to situate Hamptons' view. So let's take a possible world. It's not actual. This is a very fanciful objection. If you think it's incoherent, this only backs up me. So speakers in this world successfully refer to an object by referring to all parts of greater fundamentality, and fundamentality is ranked by size, and this universe is infinitely divisible. So I refer to the table in virtue of referring to its left half and its right half, and refer to the left half in virtue of referring to the left half of the left half and the right half and the right half, sorry, the right half of the left half, and so on and so on and so on. So we have an infinite descending dependency chain of reference here. Maybe you think this is non-vicious, maybe you think this is incoherent, but this is going to help us understand where Hamptons is going wrong with his account of reference. So epistemological considerations show that you can't tell a similar story in the Hamptonsian case. So recall that Hamptons thinks that we refer using concepts specified by first order descriptions. So here, it looks like each of these concepts is being employed on a given occasion of reference. So we're using infinitely many concepts. Now that seems to be absurd, that I could be employing infinitely many set-theoretic concepts on a single occasion of reference. And it really looks like this is non-eliminable. So in the table case, the reference was secured by the fact that I didn't have to have a concept of the left half and the right half of the table in order to refer to them. It was just guaranteed by the fact I have perceptual contact with the table. Hamptons' whole account of reference is based on the link between concepts and descriptions, so it looks ineliminable. So we're going to see how this, a bit later, how this is relevant. One way to go would be, look, let's just take some concepts as absolute. If we can take enough concepts to absolutely delimit the extent of the multiverse, we'd avoid this regress. So we might need such a stock of sufficiently rich, absolutely understood concepts. Not just any model will do, would be the slogan. Okay, so problem 2, a little more technical, but I don't think we need to focus too much on the technical details here. So this problem is going to crop up intra-universe as well. So the way Hamptons has to be keen of doing the forcing is by having a partial order within the model, defining a generic on that partial order, and then this assigns values to the particular name. So we develop these names within the model, and then the generic goes through and assigns them. But if we're in a particular ground model M, this doesn't contain G, it doesn't know about G. And this is the various tricks to avoid this, but it looks like we actually need to move to MG to do this. But hang on a minute. M was our background concept of set that we fixed there. I mean, let's allow him that he can fix a background concept. How do we get to MG rather than some other forcing extension there? It doesn't seem that he has the conceptual resources to pick out the objects he wants to pick out. So now the third problem, draw some conclusions from this. So this is, for anyone who's read Stuart's book, this is familiar, and we've seen issues like this crop up already today. So if you've got any particular notion of finiteness phi, It's going to have an infinite model by compactness, because it should have a model of every size n. But then, this is key to understanding various notions that we want to keep, we want to have absolutely understood. So, what happens to our notion of proof, of well-formed formula? Do we have some infinite formulae or something like this? So we might take this as evidence that we need enough to be absolutely understood that we can get a coherent meta theory out. I'll say a little more on this in a minute. I don't think you necessarily need that, but I think that is one way you could go. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, it looks like Hamptons has kind of, cut off his own ankles by accident. He's trying to give this very relativistic account, and in doing so has kind of hobbled the things that we need for our standard mathematical practice. So one solution is to just restore cogency to the multiverse, allow some notions to be absolute. So possibly finiteness might be one, natural number might be another. And then you're going to end up with, these other multiverse views. So plausibly the hyperuniverse program of Cy Friedman et al. John Steele has a version where we think something like, it's quite a complicated view, but the large cardinals are kind of privileged in some way, and develop a generic multiverse around that. But I think there's another way Hamptons could go and hold on to this kind of very strong relativism. And that involves just looking at exactly how far he's prepared to go. So if you look at the meta theory problem, Hamptons has now got some work in which he just bites this problem, and in spectacular fashion. So here is an example of that. So Hamptons developed some models that have exactly the same natural numbers. So these are our natural numbers here. And he says absolutely this. The meta theory is completely relative to background concept of set. And via this, he lays on top of this two different meta theories, the interpretation of our formulae. And one of the models, they have exactly the same natural numbers. One of the models satisfies that a particular object within that model is even, and the other one satisfies that it is odd. So that's a pretty extreme consequence of just how far this relativism goes. So that's the kind of first thing I want to say is, you thought Hamptonsian multiversism was a strong, radical kind of relativism. It's even possibly stronger than you think. But we can situate, I think, him better with respect to the referential regress. If we look at him as part of, or in fact don't look at him in the end, as part of this tradition of using description to avoid the Ben-Serafian worry about the causal theory of truth and how we gain knowledge of mathematical objects. So there's this tradition where we use description to avoid this. So on the second order side, we've got Rumford, Isaacson, and plausibly Shapiro, where we think, we have second order descriptions, and these pin things down to up to isomorphism. That's how we gain our mathematical knowledge. Then on the first order side, we've got Mark Balagua, who thinks that, the universe of mathematics multiverse of mathematics is so plentiful that there will always be a universe to satisfy that a particular first order description. And if we look back earlier, it was this kind of, we're using descriptions to refer to universes, they're correlated with concepts. That's what led to the issues of regress. And indeed, Hamptons says some things that are infelicitous in this regard. So things like, we refer to a set concept via description. So I think what Hamptons should really do is just chuck that out. Just not try and deal with the Ben-Serafi problem, not see his argument as dealing with the Ben-Serafi problem. And then you can modify his view as follows. So there's no one privileged universe of set, but rather many equal universes. So an utterance of some set theoretic statement, fine, it should be construed as merely explaining what one would be able to construct given any universe n that thinks both it and some other objects G and H, possibly not in n, have the properties stated in phi. So we don't even know what the extent of the multiverse is. We're just saying, look, if you were to find yourself in a particular model with these, that even thought it had these properties, you would be able to perform these kind of constructions on that model without trying to provide, an explicit extent of the multiverse or say that he's referring to a particular universe. Now, if you want to, you can supplement this account with some either Magadorian or Finian account of arbitrary reference. So I don't even know what the extent of the multiverse is, but I nonetheless pick out some particular one. And taking Hamptons this way has the rather odd view that was discussed a lot in the last talk, that two people can be speaking the same sentences, understanding one another, but talking about radically different subject matters. I mean, your arbitrary selection of a model might pick out, this multiverse. My arbitrary selection of a model might end up with this universe. They might not even intersect, but nonetheless, we're able to communicate and do set theory together and understand what each other mean. But while I'd love to press that objection against Hamptons, it doesn't seem to me to be an issue that's peculiar to his view. So this is just a general problem in the philosophy of mathematics. I mean, think about non-standard models. You and I are having a discussion, let's be absolutist. You and I are having a discussion about some non-standard models. The one I have in mind is one that I've constructed via a compactness argument. The one you have in mind is just some weird model that we don't very much know much about as a consequence of the Mistovsky collapse or something like that. I mean, we could communicate perfectly well as long as we don't use any properties of the models kind of extraneous to the essential properties of the model, namely that it's non-standard and we can still prove stuff. So I think this really highlights there's a big issue here in the philosophy of mathematics, and one that how we go with it is radically going to inform these different conceptions of ontology available on the table. So just to sum up, I mean, I think Hamptons' view, I think is tremendously elegant, but it does run into these philosophical issues. I mean, the relativism is bone-crushingly strong with respect to how we refer in one way, but also just the very most basic concepts. I mean, I personally find it's almost a reductio of the view that he has these kind of satisfaction worries. But each to his own, and that doesn't constitute an objection. That I find that very intuitively strange. And one way we might go with this solution is just allow enough absolute concepts to specify the bare essentials to kind of start to get a grip. Even if we might be multiversists higher up, we just need the bare essentials to enable us to get started. The solution, second pass, just completely do away with the Beno-Serafian problems. Don't worry about it. Say that we refer to these arbitrary things, we don't even know which ones. Continue to regard almost every concept as relative, and provide some wider philosophical account of how communication doesn't break down. So I think there's some really interesting options on the table here, and I'd be really interested in hearing what you guys think about this. So thank you very much.
Okay, keep your hands up. Okay, bear in mind that we need to get out of here today. So can you put your hands up again? So who goes first and then get to front.
Which way first?
It's contrasting impressions. Contrasting. The first is the fact that as with the notion of multiverse, in a sense, in physics, well, one say yes, but where do all these universes live? In the universe, and I want something like a super universe and say everything is there. the sense, the very sense of the universal set is the ultimate, as Marty said somewhere, the ultimate ontological court of everything is there. Then I have to explain, okay. But this is one. On the other hand, it seems to me that what you call the star, like at the end, one of the last few slides, that's very reasonable. If you think the way in which all the story began with Cohen took account of a model, okay, and then he forced on that model, okay. The problem was not how do you know that that model with which I start is the right one, where is it, how do I find it, with the regress, etc. I don't care about that. Yeah. But I don't care because I have good reasons to avoid these problems, because I have philosophical worries, but are not relevant to what I'm doing from the point of view of the mathematical concepts that I'm treating with that method. You see what I'm saying? But so it seems to me that what you put there as that option, in a sense, it's strange, but it's quite reasonable if you look at the practice of forcing.
Yes, I think there's a number of things to say here. I mean, how short do I have to keep my answers? Just out of interest. Pretty short. Okay. So I think the first thing off the bat, about 50% of the notions you just used, which I think seem absolutely understood there, are completely relative to Hamptons. So accountability, I can collapse whatever I want to over here, so this goes out the window. But nonetheless, just maybe I can say a little word about the practice of forcing. So I think the practice of forcing is actually quite radically changed from the days when Cohen was doing it. So back when Cohen was doing it, it was all about provability. So can I construct a model that exemplifies these things? Whereas now it's a little bit about proving theorems. So you look at embeddings from VG into V to figure out some large cardinal properties. It matters. If you're thinking about subject matter, it matters that you're talking about that cardinal. Otherwise, you're kind of missing the intended interpretation of that forcing argument. There's a whole bunch of other things to say, but I guess I'll leave it there and chat to you later.
Okay, I have a very small, it's more than a question, it's an observation kind of thing. So it's the first time I see this multiversism, but on the other hand, I'm quite acquainted with what is called dynamic propositional logic, which really remind me of what we are presenting here.
So let's just make sure we're talking about the same thing. So this is where you kind of get a whole shift in
exactly.
The model.
You have a model, and instead of a big universe, as you say, you pass from one model to another, and what you focus on is the passage from one to another. So I was wondering if someone has already noticed this analogy, and if this analogy would serve to get an even stronger...
I don't know if anybody's explicitly done it with dynamic semantics. I mean, it is niche, I'm prepared to admit that. So I would anticipate not. Something Hamptons does do is give them really modal. He outlines the modal properties of forcing, which is kind of linked to that. I don't really understand the dynamic semantics and stuff yet, but I gather it's a sort of similar modal notion. You kind of have the ways it can. So maybe there's a parallel. Maybe there's a parallel to draw.
See, I was wondering whether this to reply to your infinite regress objection against Hamptons.
Yeah, sure.
I was wondering whether the right diagram to be used in order to represent a multiverse is the one you have drawn. Because, for instance, if you take seriously the classical interpretation of modal logic in terms of possible worlds, perhaps you can choose in the place of the actual world your ground model, and then have your accessibility relation to all the models that you are generating by means of forcing, for instance, starting from your ground model. Well, if you do that, so if you have this tree developing from a trunk represented by your ground model, then you can see that in a sense there is no infinite regress there.
Yeah, for sure.
Another thing.
Can I answer that one? Otherwise,
it's connected with this. You must be aware that one of the interpretation of measurement in quantum mechanics is the many-world interpretation.
yeah, sure.
Everett's idea. So every single time you make a measurement or whatever it is, a spin or whatever it is, the property of the particle, then all possibilities are somehow realized in somehow parallel worlds. So you have this, and this seems to be a kind of similar analogy to the accessibility relation existing between the possible worlds and the actual world and the possible worlds, which I mentioned before. And I wanted to know what do you think about this?
So I'll answer the quantum mechanics one first, which I think is very, very interesting, but knowledge of quantum mechanics is probably slightly above my pay grade. So I think, look, it's really interesting. I mean, those models in quantum mechanics, fascinating. I don't understand exactly what is going on at the root. I feel like I understand a lot more in the set theory case. To answer your first question, sure, you could pick a initial ground model. This is basically what Steele does. I mean, he says, look, it's plausible that we select, say, Wooden's ultimate L as the initial ground model. But you've got to accept, if you're going to do that, you have the concepts, the stock of concepts to refer to that. That's precisely what Hamptons doesn't have. You say, fix the initial ground model to limit the sensitive multiverse. How do you do that? You have no way of doing it. You don't even know what a well-formed formula is yet.
Really quick follow-up from
There's a really quick follow-up. When you think about a chemical transitive model and all the genetic extension you have, this is actually Putin's multiverse. And actually this definition of this multiverse is also invariant under forcing. So actually you don't have the problem of regression in this case.
Yes.
So actually you have something that is more fixed than Hankinen's multiverse. The problem you were referring to, that you don't know which model you are picking up, actually it's the same problem you have with forcing, with any kind of application of forcing, because you choose a countable transitive model, but you don't know what is it. It could be B, because maybe B is a countable transitive model. So actually you don't know anything, but still you don't know anything when you are doing forcing. So it's not a major problem. And also the reference to B is just an abuse of notation. And it's practice.
I agree.
It's practice. There is a philosophical idea behind, but this is not the follow-up. So sorry.
just very quickly, as a paid-up absolutist, I agree. It is absolutely abuse of notation. We should all think.
Okay, I promise it to be very fast. So,
Sure.
what are your thoughts about the so-called Settheoretic geology developed from later 2004 and then
Yes.
in 2011-12?
So this is this is the Hampkinsian stuff with, you find the ground and then you're looking for the bedrock and the mantle. My answer is, what do I think about it? It's an integral part of Hampkins' project. I need to figure out exactly what I want to say about that in terms of ontological interpretation. I need to hit the books really, because it's tough stuff, and I don't yet have a full grasp of exactly the technical role those things are playing in Hampkins' account. So sort of unsatisfying answer, but get back to you in 6 months.
Okay, so I'm following. We should stop here.